to Francis.
Yes, let's stay in the United States. Our correspondent there, Harry Horton, is with us. Harry, how has her death hit the newspapers in the capital?
Well, here in Washington, we've had some reaction from lawmakers in Congress. No official reaction from the White House so far, although it must be said that this administration doesn't tend to make comments about the passing of world figures and people like Winnie Mandela, unlike previous administrations would have done here in the United States. But from Congress, Maxine Waters, who is a very prominent Democratic congresswoman, she met Nelson and Winnie Mandela when they travelled to the United States back in 1990. She said Winnie Mandela especially empowered and galvanised women to rise up and speak out against the abuses of the apartheid regime in South Africa. She said that she was one of those women who was inspired, in fact, to pass legislation in the California State Law House to divest pension funds from South African businesses at the time. She said that was one of the most defining moments of her life and career. Elsewhere, Karen Bass, who is another Democratic congresswoman and chair, or the Democratic chair of the Africa caucus, she said the world has lost an advocate, a warrior and a champion for the rights of all people. Miss Mandela's lifelong fight for freedom and equality will be remembered in the hearts of the thousands who would not be free today without her struggle. Outside of Washington, many reactions from celebrities as well, especially in Hollywood, and also civil rights activists. Jesse Jackson, a very prominent civil rights activist here in the United States, said that in the darkest hours of struggle to free South Africa with Nelson Mandela in prison, the face of hope and courage was Winnie Mandela. May she forever rest in peace. So many reactions here from Washington. I should also say that this week is the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. There'll be many commemorations in Washington over the next few days. I've been told by some people organising those commemorations that they've actually adapted their programmes now to include a moment of silence or a moment of respect to Winnie Mandela. So lots more reaction to come from Washington over the next few days.
You're creating a sense for us that she is a recognizable name, maybe not a household name, but you're talking about celebrities, politicians will know all about Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. Absolutely.
I mean, certainly for a generation here in the United States who were around during the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa, she inspired many of them to become activists here in the United States. So there are many people of that era who were deeply affected by the news of her death. I mean, certainly it was a prominent news story here in the United States. It did happen over a holiday weekend, but it featured prominently on all the evening news bulletins here in Washington and indeed across the country. So it was a big news story. Her obituaries have featured prominently in newspapers here in the United States. So certainly a big story and a big legacy that people will be discussing over the course of the next few days here in Washington.
Are the papers dealing with the darkest sides of her legacy?
Well, you're right to say that there hasn't been universal praise of Winnie Mandela. Some of the newspapers have touched upon that. For example, the Washington Post described her as beautiful and violent. It said that her bravery under the brutal apartheid regime won her lasting respect and adulation. Allegations that she was the kingpin of a deadly vigilante group during the 80s earned her fear and mistrust. The New York Times also chose to mention in the obituary a claim that Mandela grew to resent being overshadowed by Nelson Mandela. So certainly here in the United States, she hasn't been met, or certainly her legacy isn't of universal praise, and some of the newspapers have touched on that. But for the most part, the people I've spoken to here in Washington will be commemorating her death over the next few days in conjunction with those commemorations of the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's death. So a significant week of commemorations here in Washington when it comes to civil rights movements in the United States and indeed around the world as well.
And Harry, in finality, it seems to confirm that because of the media that she's always attracted, she really helped the world, at least, if nothing else, to understand what was going on in South Africa during those years.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, certainly she captured the attention of this nation during that time. The fact that she did managed to inspire, around the world, but of course specifically we're talking about here in the United States, a generation of activists to kind of act in solidarity with South Africa during the apartheid struggles. I think that shows the sort of legacy and the sort of reach of her message here across the United States. So, a very prominent figure for many people saddened by the news of her death, and many people really feel compelled that that even though we are in the United States, that they must in some way honour her legacy this week, given that it falls in the same week as such a significant week for civil rights here in the United States.
Yeah, so we'll see if she is mentioned in those commemorations marking Martin Luther King tomorrow. Thank you very much, Harry Horton, live for us from Washington.